Hi, this is the 4.3 Big Business Summary. If you haven't already, please go to the other 4.3 video. It's also linked online. In this unit, I'll talk about the rise of big business and the increased industrialization in the United States. This section has a lot of important terms. The first term that we really need to talk about is capitalism. Capitalism is characterized by private ownership of property and the factors of production, and the use of that property to make a profit. That's what the system of capitalism is. Before the Civil War, businesses raised large amounts of money by selling stock, and then they were able to start their company after selling that stock. After the Civil War, corporations became larger by mergers and monopolies, and that's when people began to criticize corporations for gaining too much power. To summarize, the basic idea behind capitalism is that people own the factors of production, not the government, and that those people are trying to make as big of a profit as possible. And then whenever they're unchecked by the government, sometimes they can gain too much power, like monopolies. The railroad industry was central to all of this economic growth. It was the economic engine that drove the economy. The Transcontinental Railroad had just been built, and it united the East and the West and developed a national market like we talked about in the previous unit. Industries were also affected by the railroad industry because of either providing materials for for railroad or because a railroad helped ship industry goods. Some of those industries were steel, lumber, meatpacking, and coal. In addition, new towns developed along the railroad's route and became big cities, like Chicago, for instance. Competition was also very brutal between the railroads, and a lot of railroads ended up going out of business and losing a lot of money. And that ended up leading to economic depressions throughout the country. In this time period, there were some new entrepreneurs that have new business practices, and they end up controlling a few of the industries in the United States. The first of those is Andrew Carnegie. He controlled U.S. Steel. What he did was he used vertical integration to control the entire industry. So what that means is he bought out his suppliers, he bought out his distributors, basically everything that he needed to make the product, he bought them out so that he could make more money. Carnegie controlled much of the steel industry, and he's interesting because he's actually a self-made man. He's actually one of the only examples of starting poor and becoming rich. The other important industrialist that we need to look at is John Rockefeller. He owned Standard Oil. What he did was he drove his competitors out of business and used horizontal integration. What that means is he set his prices really, really low. His competitors couldn't keep the same prices, and they'd end up going out of business, and then he would swoop in and buy up their businesses. That's horizontal integration, where he'd buy out his competitors. It's kind of what Walmart gets criticized for today. He also used a business practice called a trust, which is basically a monopoly to set up these huge companies that controlled entire industries. Basically, a trust was just a company that would buy up stock of a bunch of different companies, and then that way he controlled the entire industry through his trust. The Sherman Antitrust Act actually was passed around this time, and it was meant to outlaw that from happening so that monopolies couldn't get entire control over the industry. Unfortunately, the government used it to outlaw labor unions instead of trust, and it actually ended up hurting a lot of the labor unions and the workers. There are some pros and cons of these big business owners. Some of the critics of them called them robber barons, and they thought the government protected them too much and that they had too much power and that they basically were stealing from the poor and they weren't really helping their workers. It did lead to economic instability and frequent economic depressions. There was so much instability because of all the different mergers that were going on. So the companies kept changing hands and new companies were forming, and so it was really kind of a mess, and that's what's going to lead to economic instability, and the depressions happened as a result of that. Conversely, there are a lot of people who do like the idea of the big business owners. Instead of calling Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt robber barons, they called them captains of industry. And a lot of these guys would justify their actions by using a couple phrases. One was social Darwinism. What they did was they took the Darwinist belief of survival of the fittest and they applied it to the business world, meaning that if someone works hard, then they're going to succeed. So successful people work hard while the unsuccessful people are lazy. They also used laissez-faire capitalism to justify it by saying that the government shouldn't regulate the economy, that the government should stay out and just kind of let them do what they're going to do because that'll make the economy stronger. However, really, the government does intervene in a lot of different ways, and the government intervenes to help management against labor, and they also set high tariffs. So the idea that the government kept its hands off the economy is kind of a myth. They just didn't regulate businesses. Instead, they helped businesses instead of the workers. Popular literature of the time also showed the myth that if anyone worked hard, then they would succeed. Horatio Alger was very famous for that. It's this whole idea of rags to riches, where you can start poor, and if you work really, really hard, then you'll succeed. Unfortunately, though, that's not really true. Most of the guys that are rich in this time period are rich because their parents were rich. Really, one of the only examples of this was Andrew Carnegie, who went from being poor to being rich. The gospel of wealth was another important term at the time. And really what that said was that business owners had a responsibility to help others. And Carnegie and Rockefeller do give millions away to philanthropies. In fact, there are a lot of libraries that are named after Carnegie because he gave so much money to universities and to cities to build libraries. Newspapers would even keep track of how much money Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, how much those guys had given away to different charities. Even though we'll point out a bunch of negatives about monopolies, the standard of living does go up during this time period, and people are able to afford a lot more products than they were ever able to afford before. And part of that's because of the Industrial Revolution, there are a lot of new products. However, one of the negatives is that there's a deflation because there's so many products out there, especially new farming equipment, which is going to cause farmers' prices to go down because it's so much easier to produce crops. Besides farmers, another negative is the fact that most workers still have very, very low wages and make hardly any money, and a lot of them can't afford to even buy the products that they make. A common misconception to avoid, though, is that the assembly line was already in place. It wasn't in place. It wasn't in place until Henry Ford. That concludes section 4.3 summary. Please go and watch the full-length video that's also linked online. Also go to Edmodo to turn in your notes guide and take the video quiz. Thank you.